but we're going to focus on the antibiotic entry as our point, but and some consent issues. So just to first one update of where we are, we have now recruited over 135 participants. It's obviously a rolling number. I think it might be 137 right now with the recent two recruits. So it was great to get over the 100 patient number, and they keep coming in regularly. So that's great. Thank you for all your efforts doing that. Gradually getting more and more patients into the GM-CSF part of the trial again. So 15 patients randomized there as well, and that seems to be going smoothly. It's great to have more sites on board, and we're pleased that as well as coming on board, they also recruit their first site. So Derriford and Sunderland Royal have both randomized their first participants this month. And if my memory serves me, maybe it's Sunderland have recruited a couple very recently. So well done. We are still looking to set up more sites. The recruitment is going well in the sites that are open. We're recruiting overall to time and target in the open sites. We don't have enough sites open right now, so we are really pushing to get more sites open. So again, looking at some of the names here, I know some of you, many of you are from the open sites. So I'm maybe preaching to the choir, but if you've no friends, colleagues in neighboring hospitals, or if you are one of the sites in setup, it's really key that we get you set up as soon as possible. So keep pushing with your R&D offices. We need to get these sites open. So let's look at the recruitment per month. You can see how it's been increasing. And just to remind you, for the first 3 months, it was just the 3 sites in Imperial that were open. And it's picked up since, and the number recruited is getting higher each month. 19 was our biggest month in October. And already in last week and seeing that first week of November, a fair few were coming through. So it's great to see the patients being recruited. I know there was a previous session around inclusion exclusion criteria, going through all of that, which I couldn't attend. I think it was led by Danny McCauley. And just to add an overall commentary on that, just to remind you about the inclusion exclusion criteria when people ask us questions. The idea of SepTiC is it's supposed to be a very pragmatic, real world evidence trial. So the exclusion criteria are supposed to be quite few. We expect most patients to be eligible. There are just a few exceptions. So I would say if you are querying whether the patient may or may not be included, the chances are they probably are eligible. Just to put that as a phrase, your mindset. It is really the general population of septic patients in the ICU we're looking to recruit. By all means, ask us questions. But if you're thinking they might be eligible, they probably are. So have that mindset when you're looking, and hopefully we can get our recruitment rates even higher. So we're going to talk about the antibiotic dosing. I will hand over in a moment to Paulina, who's going to talk you through how to enter the data. But just to remind you why we're collecting this information and our thinking behind what we were doing. The whole idea of the PCR and the procalcitonin test is just about improving antibiotic stewardship that we hope will improve clinical outcomes. But if we can show it improves antibiotic stewardship, that will be useful. So it needs to be a little bit more than just duration of antibiotics, because it may be the choice of antibiotic. And therefore, our sort of primary measure of antibiotic use is around defined daily doses. And so Paulina will explain to you how we're capturing that, but that's why it's important that we get that information on a daily basis about knowing the total antibiotics prescribed for patients. So let me just say, so if you had a chart looking like this with multiple different antibiotics on different days, how would you enter it into the database? So as I said, we do need it on a daily basis. So if we go to the next slide. So at baseline, you see the patient is on the 2 antibiotics, metronidazole and the piptazo, tazobactam, whatever you want to call it, tazocin. And you can see it here. So you need to enter both of these antibiotics. And so on the form, if you go to the next bit, it would look like this. You tick the two antibiotics. You could see the metronidazole 500 milligrams once a day IV that that patient had got, and also the tazocin 4.5 grams 3 times a day IV. And as you see, it calculates the total daily dose for you at the bottom. Next slide. Then the next day, the metronidazole has stopped for whatever reason. This is just a made-up example we might give you. So there's been a change in the antibiotics, and we ask you that on the CRF to say there's been a change. So you just tick the yes because there has been a change. It's not identical to the day before. And then when you do that, you tick the yes, and then you enter those antibiotics, the tazocin again for that next day, just as we did before, the 4.5 grams TDS IV. And just don't enter the metronidazole one. We will see the statisticians will see that that has stopped. So we will know that the antibiotic has stopped, but it does require you to enter the one that continues on that next day. Then on the third day, a new antibiotic, or in this case, an antifungal, has been added. A fluconazole has been added. And so again, you would need to enter that the antibiotics have changed on day 2 because there is a change. There is a new one added. And on the data entry form, so yes, you tick the yes. And then you fill in the 2 again, the piptazo 3 times a day and the fluconazole, the dose, and it's given once a day. Then on the third day, there has been no change. It's continued exactly the same as before. The tazocin continues, the fluconazole continues. And so then all you need to do is tick no. The patient, there's been no changes to the antibiotics and nothing else needs to be entered. So we've done that to try and minimize the data entry. So nothing other than to say no. And obviously we would expect frequently that to be the case from one day to the other. The antibiotics may not change. So you just select the no. And then on the following day, day 4 here, you could see, in fact, there's been now a complete change. The other antibiotics have stopped and new ones, completely new ones have been added. As I said, this is just a made up example. Before you ask me about the biological rationale for why people may have chosen these antibiotics. But again, you would tick that there has been a change, tick yes, and then you come to enter those new antibiotics on. Again, you don't need to enter what has stopped. We will know what has stopped by the fact that you haven't entered it anymore. So now you would open up the database and you add the ceftriaxone and the amoxicillin that you've added with the right doses. And again, you can see it's calculated the overall total doses. And then on day 5, in this case, the antibiotics have all stopped. And then again, all you need to do is write all antibiotics have stopped. And that would be the end of the antibiotic data collection for this period of time while the antibiotics have stopped. We do need to do, as we mentioned, we're measuring the number of defined daily doses up until day 28. We do need this data entered on a daily basis if they are on antibiotics. Obviously, if they're not on antibiotics and are free, then you don't need to enter anything. As I said, if the antibiotic stops, you don't need to enter that. We will know it's there because that it's not there. We will know that it has stopped. So you only need to enter the currently prescribed drugs. If anything about the antibiotics, such as the dose changes, then you do need to change that and let us know because that's how we will calculate the defined daily doses. So you do need to enter a change if there is a change in dose, or as you saw, if there's an addition of an antibiotic or the removal of an antibiotic. And as I said, if all antibiotics have been stopped, and there are nothing, then you just click no to the question whether there has been any change to the previous day. So hopefully it minimizes the data collection. We set it up this way. We've hoped to try and balance that we get all the information on a daily basis, but with the minimal amount of data entry. We did think about whether we could make it that if you're on an antibiotic, it automatically carried over, but we felt there was actually then a concern that if we did that, it was could easily be that people would stay on because people would forget to stop them, and it would then be difficult if people change the doses. So that is why we've gone for this, which we hope is the right balance between getting accurate data but not overburdening you with data collection. So
Yep.
some
I can jump in here now, Tony.
Okay, yep.
So just following on from Tony's discussion there, we've got a few common questions about antibiotic data. So first question, how should we enter stat doses into the database? So we're quite flexible in how your site would like to enter this information. So it's up to you if you'd like to enter the stat dose as a separate entry or include this in the total antibiotic dose for the daily dose. We would suggest to enter it separately, as this will clearly differentiate the two doses. But again, it's what sort of is easiest for you. Should we be including antifungals in the antibiotic entry? So the answer is yes. So we do have a drop-down list that includes the antifungals. We've got a few examples here, and we also have an option where you can select other. So then you can actually transcribe the antifungal, but we are not collecting antivirals. So antibiotics and antifungals. How should the antibiotics infusion doses be entered to the database? So if an antibiotic is being administered as an infusion throughout the day, simply add the total amount administered and enter this as one antibiotic entry into the database. If the patient was not given the prescribed dose of the antibiotic, should I add the amount given or the prescribed dose? So please enter the prescribed doses, even if the patient was not given the full prescription. Okay, and yep, I'll hand
Maybe
over
we
to
just
Rafi. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Do you want to
Should we
pause there?
just pause there if people
Yep.
got questions about the antibiotics? And I just add the commentary around the stat dose, which Janice explained well. But just to explain why we said this flexibility, sometimes a stat dose may be if you have electronic prescribing and it comes up at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. for a BD dosing. Some sites may give a stat dose at 10 a.m., for instance, if you've missed the 8 a.m. And it's therefore up to you whether you say that's a BD dosing still or a stat dose. It doesn't matter because it's the same defined daily dose. We want to capture what you're given. So that's why we said you could capture it anyway. Maybe some antibiotics you gave a loading dose, maybe the fluconazole, you might give a bigger first dose. So you might capture that as a stat and then start the regular prescription the next day. As I said, there's some flexibility. We try to make it as simple as possible for you. But if anybody's got any questions specifically about antibiotics, we'll just pause there, as that was one of the main things we just wanted to help you with, because we do get a few questions about it. If not, I'll hand back and then we'll carry on with the presentation. There'll be time for questions at the end, but why don't we carry on?
Thanks, Tony. So following on from the antibiotic data entry advice, we just wanted to give some generic open clinic advice, which we've mentioned in some previous webinars, but just as a reminder to please use Google Chrome as the recommended browser for logging into the database. This is just in terms of functionality. And when completing a form, please only click complete if the form is complete and all data entry has been done. If there is any missing data and you know that you're going to check the notes or any other information before coming back, please just click close. So this lets us know that some data entry is still pending on the database. And just as a reminder, the timings for the data entry, day 1 is from randomization until the end of the chart day. And this is for the fluid balance and the antibiotic data entry. And then day 2 and every day after is from the chart day onwards. And as now sites are open and entering data, there will be some queries that appear. We just want to remind all our sites to regularly review the queries. When you enter the database, at the top right-hand corner, you'll see a queries button. If you click that, you should see the queries for your site. In terms of answering them, when you open them up, please write an answer where it says respond to query. It could just be data entered or a reason why a result is out of range or perhaps why it's missing. And then after writing the response, please click update. Sometimes if it's missing data, you will need to enter the data onto the actual CRF and in addition to responding to the query, as if the answer is written in the query, we'll be unable to update the CRF with that information. And then I'll just hand over to Janice to cover the consent section.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ravi. I think there have been a few comments in the chat, but I think Tony, you're answering them. Is there anything you want to clarify? You're happy for us to carry on for now? Yeah, okay, fine. Again, we've got time for questions at the end. So just moving on to consent. So we thought we'd take this opportunity as well, just to give you a refresh on our consent process. So I'll just cover the points on this slide, and then we have a few other slides just with some scenarios. So if the patient has capacity, please do obtain patient consent. So that's the informed consent form that we have available. If the patient does not have capacity, please approach the family first. So that's a personal legal representative. If the patient does not have capacity and the personal legal representative is not available, then we ask that you approach a professional legal representative. So that is a doctor not listed on the delegation log. So it's an independent doctor. When the patient regains capacity, we ask that you obtain retro consent before they're discharged. And just a note there to say that if the personal legal representative is not visiting for the next 24 hours, approach a professional legal representative in the meantime. So this is when if the patient doesn't have capacity and you know that the family member isn't visiting immediately, so within the next 24 hours, it's best practice to obtain consent then from a professional legal representative in the meantime, and then follow up with the personal legal representative when they do come into the hospital. All consent conversations with the patient, family, and pro-alar must be documented in the medical records. And it is imperative that we explore all avenues to ensure the patient or family are aware of their participation. We do have telephone consents and postal consents available to follow up with the patient if they've been discharged before written consent is obtained. And just to summarise those points here, so please ensure any discussions with the patients and or their next of kin are documented in the notes. Ensure retrospective consent or per-alar consent is obtained before discharge. If the patient regains capacity and is discharged before retrospective consent is obtained, then please follow up with verbal or postal consent. If this is not successful, please explain the attempts made and the discussions held in a file note. So we have that documentation. Please contact the patient for telephone consent after they've been discharged. So if you don't manage to get retrospective consent while the patient is in hospital and they're discharged, please do follow them up with a telephone call. Patients are contacted at 6-month follow-up as well. So telephone consent can also be obtained during this follow-up telephone call. And then a physical retrospective consent can be sent out. So just a few scenarios here to illustrate those points. So if a patient does not have capacity and you speak to the family and they're supposed to come in and visit, but we miss them, we then randomize the patient via deferred consent because we have the approval to do that, and we're waiting for the family to come in. So in this situation, it could be that the patient perhaps could be discharged before we ever obtain any consent. So we ask that you obtain pro-alar in the meantime, just so we have some form of consent. And in the initial call, it'd be great if the study can be at least discussed with the family, but if not, approach a pro-alar for the consent. And the issue may arise where we don't catch the family in time, and so we could have a patient randomized And then a few days could pass, and then we try and approach a pro-Rel who may not be happy then to provide their consent so many days after randomization. So we just want to make sure that we have some consent in place as soon as possible. And the next scenario, so a patient that does not have capacity at the time of randomization and there's no family available, the patient is randomized with pro-Rel consent. The patient has now regained capacity but was discharged quickly before we could obtain retro consent. So in this situation, please follow up with the patient via telephone or post. So we have lots of consent models available now to ensure that we inform the patient of the study. So we ask that you call the patient, explain the trial over the telephone, obtain verbal consent over the telephone, and also post the consent form to them. But if they don't return it, because we have a verbal consent, this is still considered consent to the trial, so we can still continue with the verbal consent. We do have a flowchart available as well, which is on our website, which gives you a nice algorithm, if you like, in terms of how to follow the consent model. But the main takeaway is that we want to make sure that every patient that is randomized into our trial is aware of the trial. And if they don't have capacity, the family member is aware of the trial wherever possible. So we want to avoid the situation where a patient has been discharged with capacity and has no recollection of being informed of the trial. So make sure you explain any conversations held within the medical records and do all we can to try and follow up with the patient and provide them information about the trial. And now I think we're moving on to questions.
Thanks, Janice and Ravi. If people have got questions, either put up, if your camera's on, your electronic hand is easier to see, or as you can see, just type it in the chat. I've given answers to the two that were in the chat, but just to be clear for people, the first question about how we've divided the time up from up to randomization is considered baseline. After baseline till the end of that first day is going to be a short period of time. It'll be a variable length of short period of time, but that's day one. And then from when your new day starts onwards, that's day two, and that same time point goes forward for there. Sally, I can see your hands come up. So before I say any more about yours, do you want to ask some further about the chart days, or is it a different question?
It's a different question, please.
All right, shall I do the chart days first, and then
yeah,
I've written down. Not every ICU goes midnight to midnight. And my own ICU, we go from 7 a.m. So it's particularly useful for things like the fluid balance, because that's calculated automatically by the chart, and so you only need to take that cover. So we use 7 a.m. as our start of our new day. So from randomization through to 7 a.m. counts as day one, and then day two starts after 7 o'clock. And that's fine. We know that it will vary, and if people use the same time throughout the trial, what we don't want you is you swapping and changing between individual patients. But if you use the same time point, we'll do that. And hopefully, again, that makes life easier for you to know when does each day start. The last thing we want to be doing, I've learned over the years, is calculating 24 hours from the time of randomization, which becomes a real nuisance for everybody to do. So this is a solution. So I hope that makes sense. And then Sally, if you've got a new question. Hi.
I have. I caught the bit where I can't remember Janice or Ravi. Janice mentioned electronic consent. Is that only for the patient once they've been discharged, or could we use that for the relative consent?
Yes, so with the telephone consent we have available is available for next of kin, so you can use that. So whilst the patient is in hospital, if the family member isn't physically coming in, you can obtain verbal consent with them over the telephone with our telephone consent form.
Oh, okay. But
yeah.
Okay.
So
sorry, I thought you were talking about electronic consent.
We don't have e-consent in SepTiC.
Okay.
We do have the option to sort of tag it on if we think it would be viable, but we think most feedback from sites is that the telephone consent is the most valuable. Because obviously you often get that sort of within that phone call rather than, relying on someone to maybe respond via email. But yeah, in the instructions for the telephone consent, it does explain to always post out an actual paper consent form too, unless the family member is coming in which case you can obtain written consent from them. But if we don't, at least we have verbal consent. So as a bare minimum, it's always best to use that telephone consent when you speak to the family member.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
If a patient is receiving an antibiotic 3 times a day and it is stopped after receiving 2 doses on the day it is stopped, do we record it as a change of antibiotic and 2 doses that it is stopped? Yes, that would be, yeah, if you're giving it 3 times a day, you give 2 doses and then you stop it on that day, that would be a change. You just write down the doses that were prescribed and given. And when we said that other bit about the prescribed and given, it was around sometimes, I don't know, so I think someone might have said, "Oh, the cannula tissue, they only got half the dose. Do I write down half the dose?" And we said it won't give what was intended to be given. In this case, it stopped, and so that was the intention, was to only give the 2 doses. That's what should be recorded on that last day. So you write a change on that day, write the 2 doses, and then the next day, assuming if they've all stopped, as you said, you would just write all antibiotics. More of these. Oh, Ginny, looks like you got a question. Do you want to ask?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hi, yeah, I've just got a question about the consent forms and the information sheets. I've noticed that we've got like a full information sheet and we've got a summary information sheet, and each of them have come with a different consent forms. I just want to know, when are we to give each of these, or can we give one in place of the other?
Yeah, this is a good question, Ginny. So we've got quite an array of consent forms available just to sort of cover any possible scenario. And we actually had feedback from the rec on this, in that they thought it would be helpful for us to have a patient summary form. So this is when, if you think the patient has capacity to understand, but maybe can't really digest the full sort of 10-page consent form, you can use the summary in that respect, in that you provide them with the minimum information, they're happy to consent, they provide their consent, complete the consent form. But on the summary, it does say that they should be then provided with the full copy. So they always have the full copy to refer to, and it has sort of reference to the privacy notice. And so you can provide, you must make sure that you provide them with a full copy, but you can use a summary if you think that it's too much for them to take in the full information at that time, but you think they can give consent and they do understand the study. So we've provided a few options in that respect.
And how about, sorry, thank you for that, but how about the relatives? Because we've got summary for the relatives as well. Does
Yeah,
this
exactly.
apply?
Yeah, so similar things. So the summary for the relatives, again, on the summary form itself, it refers to the full document. So you must always provide them with the full document. So that information has all the sort of detail, but the summary gives them sort of the overview of the study, so they can provide their consent based on the summary, but you must make sure that they have the full copy of the consent form as well.
Okay, so we don't have to reconsent them with the...
No.
Okay,
yeah,
that's
it's
fine then.
sufficient. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thanks. That was a good point to raise, because it came up with the ethics committee, and very much the patient and public voice there was saying many of these patients may know about what's going on and actually want to consent, but they can't read a long document. And this is the right balance between making sure they have the full information available to them if they want to read it, but actually we give them the key messages so they can actually help make a decision themselves and be involved in their care. And so I think this is a real step forward in how we consent these critically ill patients. And I think you make the good point. It's important for the relatives as well, as we know they're often overwhelmed by the circumstances, and a big, long information sheet may be too much for them at that time. But again, they want to be involved at the high level of the important aspects of the trial. So do work with them. This is try to encourage them their participation in that consent process up front, if we can. Janice, I can see May has asked a question about translation.
Yeah, thanks for that. We don't have translated documents as yet. It's something that we're working towards. So in the meantime, we ask to use the hospital translation service if possible. But we are trying, as a minimum, we're trying to arrange translations for, say, the summary and the full document. But we'll keep you updated on that.